Be careful when you enter Big Sky Country. You might just encounter some big mysteries. It's time for another historical cryptid story, researched and written by Ellen Baumler. Her information is listed in the description below. Are you aware of some of the Wendigo's history in Montana? What about Bigfoot? And did you know that President Roosevelt once recounted a Bigfoot encounter he heard from a gentleman named Bauman? Guess what? You will. If you like these creepy Montana historical tales, please hit that subscribe button along with the notification button so you make sure not to miss a video. Or if you are looking for something truly scary, encounters with ghosts, demons, cryptids, and more, check out some of my other videos in the link above. Now, relax and enjoy some more Montana cryptid stories. Terror in the Wilderness. In the deep, cold winters of the rugged Rocky Mountain wilderness and across the northern United States into Alberta, Canada, stories tell of starvation winters, of creatures that roam the remote backwoods, and of the poor souls who have fallen victim to their fellow humans. Tales of murder, cannibalism, and greed spread through the westernmost regions of Montana too, across the scenic Bitterroot-Selway wilderness into Idaho. The road through the wilderness area, even today, is one of the nation's most dangerous and remote. In hard times, when wind and snow block the mountain passes and cover the trails, and game is scarce, a terrible fate can befall those who travel here. At these times, hunger can drive a person to do unspeakable things. Native American stories warn that the Wendigo roams the northern regions from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains and as far north as the Arctic Ocean, hungry for human flesh. Most northern Native American tribes have tales explaining how a human can turn Wendigo or Wendigo by an act of cannibalism through the presence of a demon, through a dream, or by the sorcery of a shaman. The Wendigo symbolizes the phantom of hunger that stalks the forests of the north as a shape-changing spirit with a heart of ice. In times of starvation, the Wendigo story served as a deterrent to cannibalism, a taboo forbidden even when it would save one's life. Suicide or resignation to death was preferable to turning Wendigo. Assiniboine and Crees even performed a Wendigo ceremony in times of famine to reinforce this taboo. Elders taught their children to behave, or the Wendigo would come for them. From Algernon Blackwood's powerful 1910 short story, The Wendigo, to Stephen King's 1983 Pet Sematary, the mythical creature has been popularized in contemporary literature, movies, comic books, and video games. But the idea is not entirely frivolous. Anthropologists have studied a phenomenon called Wendigo psychosis. There are historical cases of this condition. It results when a person under dire circumstances dines on a fellow human and afterwards develops an insatiable taste for human flesh. One famous documented case was that of Swift Runner, a Plains Cree trapper in Alberta, Canada, who butchered and ate his wife and 5 children even though the starving family was within 25 miles of food at Hudson's Bay Post. Swift Runner, suffering from this psychosis, became a homicidal cannibal. He later confessed and was executed by hanging at Fort Saskatchewan in 1879. A remnant of the belief in Montana's Bitterroot Valley has come down through the story of Sleeping Child Hot Springs. The springs and a small creek south of Hamilton are the subject of several legends. One story dates to 1877, when Chief Joseph and his band of Nez Perce came over Lolo Pass into the Bitterroot Valley, fleeing the U.S. Army. They split into two groups that traveled separate routes. One group followed a small creek and discovered a beautiful hot springs. Fearing there could be a battle with the pursuing soldiers, they left their infants at the springs, where the lush vegetation along the banks could hide them. No confrontation materialized, and they returned some hours later. They found the children well protected and sleeping peacefully, and so named the creek and hot springs Sleeping Child. A much older legend, however, tells a different story. The name of the beautiful hot springs and creek was originally Weeping Child. Indians of long ago told about how travelers who passed near the springs would hear a child's pitiful crying. The sound would draw their attention, and they would seek out the source. Upon discovering a child weeping uncontrollably along the bank, the travelers would take pity, lifting the child in their arms. The child was starving, and the traveler would offer his finger as a pacifier. But the child greedily sucked until all the flesh was gone from the finger and then from his arm. Finally, when the child had sucked all the flesh from the traveler's body, the bones would fall to the ground. The child would then disappear and lie in wait for another unsuspecting traveler to share the same fate. The hunger was never satiated, and there was a great pile of bones of all the victims at Weeping Child Hot Springs. Local settlers renamed the springs and creek Sleeping Child, thinking it a better name for such a pastoral place. The western edge of Montana's Ravalli County follows the southern half of the Bitterroot mountain range across the border into eastern Idaho. Heavy forests and high mountain passes have a long cultural heritage and sometimes a dark past. Scarred trees in this area of western Montana and eastern Idaho are indicative of travel corridors that native people used seasonally. Majestic ponderosa pines and, less often, western larch and other types of trees of great age served as a source of nutrition in the spring when the sap was running. Food was scarce at this time of the year, and the people were hungry. Various tribes harvested the sweet inner layer of the bark, or cambium, and dried it like jerky. Harvesting cambium did not kill the trees, but did leave scars. Lewis and Clark noted the practice of peeling bark in their journals, and some scarred trees still standing today were harvested as long ago as the 1700s. Nez Perce Pass is one of these lonely routes long traveled by native people. When gold was discovered in Idaho in 1860 and 1861, and in Montana in 1862, Congress created the vast territory of Idaho in 1863 to include the western half of Montana. The territorial capital was at Lewiston, Idaho. Miners and traders used the southern Nez Perce Trail over the pass as the most direct route from Elk City, Idaho, to Bannack and Virginia City, Montana. This route was a dangerous but well-traveled pack trail. In early fall of 1863, Elk City merchant Lloyd Magruder traveled this route to Virginia City to sell a load of goods. Magruder was a well-respected citizen recently chosen as Idaho Territory's congressional representative. His business venture to the mining camps of Montana was a great success, and he planned to return to Elk City with a load of gold dust. While Magruder was in Virginia City selling merchandise, his good friend, Hill Beachy, who ran the Luna House, a hotel and stage shop at Lewiston, Idaho, had a horrifying nightmare. In his dream, Magruder was returning from Virginia City with a fortune in gold dust. As Magruder and his companions camped west of Nez Perce Pass, thieves ambushed them and killed them in a horrible manner. This greatly disturbed Beachy. He told his wife about the dream, confiding his great worry and anxiety about his friend. Mrs. Beachy cautioned her husband not to talk about it, or people would think he was crazy. Meanwhile, business in Bannock delayed Magruder's departure for Elk City. He finally set off in October 1863 with a large number of livestock and 4 companions. 4 other travelers joined the group along the way. As Beachy's dream had foretold, the new travelers ambushed the original group west of Nez Perce Pass and killed all 5. Magruder's skull was split with an axe, and his companions were killed in like fashion or shot. The murderers gleefully spent the night cleaning up the carnage. They rolled the victims in blankets and threw them into a gorge 800 feet deep, where wolves would take care of the remains. They burned the pack saddles, straps, rifles, pistols, and everything else they did not keep, gathered the melted metal in a sack, and threw it into the gorge. The 70 or more animals they did not need, they turned loose. A heavy snow was falling, and by the time the murderers left the next morning, everything lay under 2 feet of snow. There was not a sign of the grisly activity that had taken place the night before. They were certain no one could discover their terrible deeds. But as they made their way along the trail, the train of pack mules they had turned loose began to follow the tinkling bell of one of the horses, as they had been well trained to do. The heartless murderers shot some of the animals, but could not run them off. The mules kept following the tinkling bell. Finally, they drove the dozens of mules into a canyon and slaughtered them. In Lewiston, Beachy could not let go of the dream he believed to be a premonition of his friend's death. When Magruder and his party did not return at the appointed time, Beachy feared his dream had come true. Soon after, a group of 4 strangers came into Lewiston, behaving in a suspicious manner. Beachy suspected these men had killed his friend. They bought tickets for the stage at Beachy's Luna House and left their horses with a local rancher. A youngster who had worked for Magruder recognized his saddle among the tack, and a horse left with the rancher matched a horse that had belonged to one of Magruder's companions. That was proof enough for Hill Beachy. Beachy hunted down the desperados, following their trail to San Francisco, California, succeeded in having them arrested, and brought them back to Lewiston. They stood trial, and 3 of them were hanged on March 4th, 1864. These were the first legal hangings in Idaho Territory. Hill Beachy later visited the site where Magruder and his 4 companions were killed. He recovered the gruesome remains, frozen at the bottom of the gorge, and buried them. The recovered gold was returned to Magruder's family. The remote 95-mile route the ill-fated merchant took over Nez Perce Pass is known today as the Magruder Corridor. It cuts through more than 3 million acres of wilderness, as large as the combined states of Delaware and Rhode Island. Travel along this treacherous historic corridor offers breathtaking views, unchanged for hundreds of years. Its spectacular beauty is a stark contrast to the ghastly fate that befell Magruder, his companions, and his pack train. In the deep dark of night, spirits surely wander along the trail that would have taken them home. While Hill Beachy's premonition and the human greed that brought about the end of the Magruder Party are unfortunately real enough, not all believe the other long-ago tales told of Montana's remote places. Most of us would dismiss the Wendigo as a figment of the imagination. However, Theodore Roosevelt, in his book The Wilderness Hunter, tells a believable story. The book, first published in 1907, includes an incident Roosevelt heard in 1893 from a seasoned mountain man named Bauman, who spent his entire life in the backwoods. Roosevelt commented that Bauman shuddered with such revulsion at certain points in his story that it was obvious that the veteran woodsman was telling the truth. Years before, Bauman and his partner were trapping in the mountains of western Montana, between the Salmon and the Big Hole rivers. Not having much luck, they decided to follow a small stream through a pass that had a dangerous reputation. The previous year, a hunter had been killed in the area and partially eaten by some wild animal. A miner passing through had discovered the remains. The two trappers left their hobbled ponies in a grassy meadow and hiked in some distance. They made camp and set out through the dense forest. It was dark and dismal as they pushed through the tall pines and firs. Returning to camp, they found that something had paid them a visit, scattering their belongings. They thought it was a bear until they found the tracks, apparently made not by paws, but by feet. Whoever or whatever it was walked on 2, not 4. That night, the men slept under a lean-to, rolled up in their blankets. During the night, Bauman awakened suddenly. A terrible odor struck him, strong and gamey, like some wild beast. A huge form loomed in the shadows at the edge of camp. Bauman pointed his rifle and fired, but he seemed to have missed. The figure crashed through the woods. The next morning, the partners again went out trapping. When they returned, same as before, the camp had been ransacked, the ground marked with tracks of a 2-legged beast. The two men were very uneasy and gathered plenty of wood to light a fire that they kept roaring all night. Each took turns keeping watch. As before, during the night, the creature came toward the camp, but the fire kept it at bay. For a long while, it kept its distance, several times uttering a grating, sinister moan. Bauman and his partner decided to collect their traps and move on the next day. All morning, they felt as if they were being watched. 2 armed men, experienced in the woods, had no reason to be afraid, but they were. They had only 3 traps left to collect. Bauman volunteered to get them while his partner went back to pack up camp. It took longer than expected as Bauman found 3 beavers in the traps and had to stop and prepare them. He started back very uneasy. The forest seemed to close in on him, and it was with a sense of dread that he reached the camp. Bauman called out. There was no response. Smoke curled up from the campfire. The packs were ready and everything was piled neatly. But there was no sign of the partner. Bauman shouted again, and the shout stuck in his throat. There, against a fallen log, was the body of his partner. His neck was broken, and deep marks of a beast's fangs punctured his throat. The flesh was uneaten, but evidence showed that the killer had cavorted around the body, rolling on it over and over. Bauman stopped only to grab his rifle and fled. The monster in the story has traits some attribute to Sasquatch, others to the Wendigo, and still others to a less supernatural human murderer or wild animal. In recounting this incident, Roosevelt himself speculates that with time, the horror of the experience and dread of the unknown might attribute weird and elfin traits to some abnormally wicked and cunning wild beast. But whether this was so or not, no man can say. Thanks again for joining me for these true Montana cryptid stories. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the subscribe and notification buttons to know when the latest story is delivered. Want to hear your true or fictional scary story narrated by me on this channel? See the description below for how to submit your story. Please consider submitting, especially if it is a true Montana tale. Now, enjoy your evening and watch out for Wendigos and Bigfoot. I'll see you in your nightmares. Good night.